Good evening. If we are to believe certain polls, the University of Minnesota and Oxford University are maybe two of the most murderous, mysterious places on earth. So it's appropriate that you're here this evening on this cold, chill evening, but we thank you for coming out. My name is Tim Johnson, and I am the E.W. McDermott Curator of the Sherlock Holmes Collection. You're in the home of the world's largest gathering of Sherlockian material, and so it's appropriate that you're here tonight, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Minnesota Mystery Writers event this evening. Unfortunately, Wendy Leger, the University Librarian, can't be with us tonight, so she asked me to pitch in. So I'm going to read from her script and maybe ad-lib a little bit, but maybe not. But I want to take a moment before we begin the program tonight to thank our friends of the libraries. And special thanks to Gail Graham Yates, who is in her second term as president of the Friends of the Library. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank a few of our hard-working friends who were involved in planning tonight's event. And I'm going to ask them to stand when I mention their name. Karen Koepp, Chair of the Friends Events Committee, and our Mystery Event Subcommittee members. How many organizations can say that they have one of those? Now there's a mystery behind this too. I think they have a name for themselves. I won't mention it. It starts with the letter C, but you can figure that out. In addition to Karen, Maria Jetty, Maggie Ragnow, and Mary McDermott. So thank you. They conceived the idea for tonight's event and were instrumental in making it all come together. It's because of the creativity and leadership of Gail and our friends that we're able to offer these kinds of events. So thank you again for being here. The Mystery Writers event of Minnesota, and before I go on, I failed to remind you that if you haven't had a chance to put in a slip for the drawing, Linnea Stangrift from our friend's office has slips. So if you want to enter the drawing for a book, Karen, I guess you've got slips too. So fill those out so that you can enter the drawing. Raise your hand if you need a slip, and I'll continue while they're handing out those slips. The Mystery Writers event of Minnesota is an event to recognize local talent in Minnesota. Many of these writers have come to writing later in life, and all have a passion for writing that helps them produce great, can't-put-it-down mystery novels with roots in Minnesota. This impressive panel of authors, including Erin Hart, Julie Kramer, and Chuck Logan, is being moderated by William Kent Krueger. So let me introduce to you our moderator, William Kent Krueger. And I told him earlier, since I'm working off a script, I don't know the source of all these remarks, but I hope that they are not too mysterious. Raised in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, William Kent Krueger briefly attended Stanford University before being kicked out for radical activities. After that, he logged timber, worked construction, tried his hand at freelance journalism, and eventually ended up researching child development at the University of Minnesota. He currently makes his living as a full-time author. With his wife of 30 years and 2 children, he makes his home in St. Paul, a city he dearly loves. Krueger writes a mystery series set in the North Woods of Minnesota. His protagonist is Cork O'Connor, the former sheriff of Tamarack County and a man of mixed heritage, part Irish and part Ojibwe. Krueger has won the Minnesota Book Award 4 times for the novels Iron Lake, Purgatory Ridge, Copper River, and Thunder Bay. He is also the recipient of the Loft McKnight Fiction Award, the Anthony Award, the Barry Award, and the Friends of American Writers Prize. The 10th book in his series, Vermilion Drift, was just released in September of this year. William Kent Krueger grew up with a passion for writing, inspired by Ernest Hemingway, and there's the Hemingway reference. He rises early in the morning and makes his way to the St. Clair Broiler, where he dreams about the adventures of his main character, Corporal Connor. Krueger has written numerous short stories and won many prizes for his works, but his greatest accomplishment is his latest novel, Vermilion Drift, making the New York Times bestseller list. Ooh. It's my pleasure to introduce William Kent Krueger.
I have to be honest. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I have to be honest with you. My book made the extended bestseller list, and it was only there for a nanosecond. But it was enough to compel my publisher to go back to the presses and redo all my covers with New York Times best-selling author. The essence of suspense is asking a question and delaying its answer. I'm going to give you the answer to a question that may still be in your minds. The subgroup of women who put together this evening, and their name begins with the letter C, is Coven. Okay, there you go. Now you don't have to wonder anymore. I'm going to, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the panel that will be entertaining you and enlightening you this evening. To my immediate right is Julie Kramer. Although she has quickly become one of Minnesota's best-known writers in the mystery thriller genre, Julie continues to work in the field where she first made a name for herself, television journalism. She's an award-winning freelance producer for WCCO, as well as working on assignments for such prestigious programs as The Today Show, Nightly News, and Dateline. She's always been an avid reader, and when she finally tired of reading about fictional TV reporters who were obnoxious secondary characters, she decided to do something about it. The result was Stalking Susan, the first in her series, featuring the electrifying TV reporter Riley Spartz. Since then, she's added 2 more titles to her series. Her work has won or been nominated for a ton of awards, including the Minnesota Book Award, the Anthony Award, which is a big one in our genre, and the Mary Higgins Clark Award. In an interview in advance of the publication of Stalking Susan, Julie was asked about her work as a TV news producer. She said, and I quote, "My job is not glamorous. Generally, I go to spots the folks in New York don't want to go to, sometimes with just the clothes on my back. And that often means buying clean socks and underwear at gas stations in remote parts of the country and asking motel clerks if anyone's left a cell phone charger behind that's compatible with mine. It can be exhausting and unpredictable. The days can start early and go late, and every night I pray this book might be my ticket out." I'm pretty sure you're on your way, Julie. Ladies and gentlemen, Julie Kramer. Like many of us in this business, Erin Hart came a bit late to mystery writing. Prior to that, she'd done a lot of theater work, been a critic and journalist, and a writer of short stories. Since the publication of her first novel, the widely acclaimed Haunted Ground, in 2005, she's pretty much focused on writing in our genre. She's created an absolutely terrific and, dare I say, literate series, featuring Nora Gavin, an American pathologist, and Cormac McGuire, an Irish archaeologist. I suppose Ireland itself ought to be considered the 3rd character in this literary menage a trois. The 3 books currently in the series have been nominated for or won a number of awards, including the Minnesota Book Award, the Friends of the American Writers Prize, and her work has been translated into a number of foreign languages. I want to tell you something that she said about her work and Ireland. This is a direct quote. "People often ask why I chose Ireland as a setting, and I have to say that I think Ireland chose me. It's a place I've been drawn to more than any other ever since I was a child. There's something about Ireland's complex and contradictory nature, all those layers of history one on top of the other, that lends a particular resonance to the kinds of stories I feel compelled to tell. We're all glad, those of us who are fans of your work, that you are in fact compelled to tell those stories. And you know, I have to say, I'm really happy that you were compelled to come here this evening. She's not wearing it now, but for those of you who were here early, you might have seen the fact that Erin had her left arm in a sling. You have it on. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. It's not just to get the sympathy vote, it's for real. You know, we give our all for art. She was researching in Ireland, and what exactly happened?
I was climbing up, can you hear me? Climbing up a hill fort on an island off the west coast of Ireland and tripped and fell and broke my shoulder.
Oh, you know, I have this hangnail that's been... Ladies and gentlemen, Erin Hart. Like Julie, Chuck Logan comes to the crime genre with a background in journalism, sort of. For many years, he was a graphic artist on staff at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. A friendship with John Camp, aka John Sanford, led Chuck to abandon his mission of writing the great American novel and turn his efforts toward writing great American crime fiction, which he did so well that the first 4 books in his Phil Broker series all garnered starred reviews from Publishers Weekly. An extraordinary feat, believe me. In addition to the 5 books in his series, he's penned 2 standalones and also recently collaborated with John Sanford on a novel titled Heat Lightning. In its praise of Chuck, Publishers Weekly has called him, quote, an awesome storyteller with a unique voice and a flawless sense of place and mood. A man who traveled a great deal in his early life, Chuck now calls Stillwater home, and he has certainly earned a place in the top ranks of Minnesota's crime writers. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Logan. I'm going to hazard a guess that everyone here might be familiar with 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 of the authors up here this evening, but probably no one is familiar with all 4 of us. So the first thing that I would like you to do is just spend a moment very briefly telling everyone a little bit more about what it is that you do. Chuck, why don't we begin with you?
I used to get up every morning and religiously write for 4 or 5 hours. And then I found that I threw away about 95% of it. So now I spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm doing, making little notes to myself, you know. So trying to solve problems before it gets to the stage where I tear an entire book apart. I think that's one of the main things I've learned in the last however long it's been. I think I started doing this in 1995.
Just very briefly, tell us about your books. What kind of a book do you write? I know you write you have written the Phil Broker series, a couple of standalones. I know you're sort of known as a gritty writer.
I only really wanted to write one book. I wrote this huge Vietnam novel, which I couldn't sell. You know, they basically said, you know, there's an F word, there's an N word, and there's a V word. Nobody wants to hear about Vietnam. Certainly, what you're writing about has absolutely no commercial potential. Because I was an advisor to the Vietnamese, and I wrote a story about the Vietnamese, and looking at most American war fiction about that conflict, I have to look beyond American fiction. And I think the best book written about Vietnam is still probably written by Graham Greene. Because there are real, live, developed Vietnamese characters in them. Whereas in a lot of American portrayal, you know, these people are kind of off in the background. You know, it's an American psychodrama. Well, I spent 13 months there, and let me tell you, there were Vietnamese there. So and they were, you know, a great warrior race. But my buddy Camp, you know, who's saying, what do you want to do? You know, like give up this literary stuff. And so I eventually wound up writing a thriller and another thriller in this series. But I kept going back. And I'm still going back and trying to rework that story. You know, and so the thrillers, I've only actually written one mystery, actual mystery. And there's a librarian in there. You know, the main character. And during the day, she's sort of based on my sister-in-law. And so during the day, she's kind of a trim, hair in a bun, you know, lady, horn-rimmed glasses, and then after hours, she's kind of like a fishnet stocking, 4-inch heels kind of girl. I mean, I know that's a cliche from Central Casting, but anyway, that's my contribution to writing about murderous librarian. So right now, I'm still trying to explore, trying to get back and write the book that I've always wanted to write.
Erin.
Well, I wouldn't be a writer today if it weren't for the fact that I read a lot of poems by Seamus Heaney back in the mid-'80s. And he writes a lot about the bogs as kind of a metaphor for memory. The history of a place is stored and kept in bogs and preserved in bogs. And he writes about people who've been found in bogs. And I read one of his poems, and it mentions butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. Those are the lines. And I was traveling in Ireland and visiting a friend, and I said to the friend's mother, did you ever hear about people finding butter in bogs? Is that really true? And she went on to regale me with stories of all sorts of things found in bogs. Wooden carts and practice swords from the Middle Ages and entire roads from 2,000 years ago. And then she told me a story about two brothers cutting turf who found the severed head of a beautiful red-haired girl who was so well preserved that you could tell how beautiful she'd been, and she'd probably been in the ground for about 400 years. And immediately I thought, well, that is the opening for a mystery novel. And so I, spent 10 years thinking about it, and finally sat down and wrote that novel, which became Haunted Ground. And as soon as I had sent 50 pages to my agent, she said, well, this is a series, right? And I said, yes. And so Lake of Sorrows was the second in the series. And so the two main characters that I write about are an archaeologist who specializes in wetlands excavation, so things found in bogs, which is very handy, and a pathologist who was Irish-born but grew up in St. Paul, so I kind of have the Minnesota-Ireland thing going. And so the third in the series, False Mermaid, is set about 2/3 in St. Paul and about 1/3 in Ireland. It kind of goes back and forth between the two. And I really write about the connection between the past and the present, and how the things that we find underfoot are connected with our own lives today.
I don't know if you know this, but there are great bogs in northern Minnesota.
People keep asking me,
Yeah.
do we have any bogs in Minnesota? It's like only the northern third of our state.
Julie.
I used to run WCCO TV's I-Team for many years, and this was many years ago, back when there was an I-Team. I left in early 2001 because I had young kids, and it was the kind of job that was really hard on a family. And my boss wouldn't let me go part-time, and my contract was up, and so I left. About 6 months later, I got a call from NBC News, because the world of investigative journalism is a very small world, and we know who the others are across the country who do that type of work. And they had need for an investigative journalist in Minnesota that day. It was September 11th. And they had gotten a tip that something had happened at a flight school in Minnesota. And so I ended up being the first journalist to walk into FBI headquarters in downtown Minneapolis and ask them about Zacharias Moussaoui. And I also landed the first interviews with Tom Burnett's family, and he was one of the heroes of Flight 93. If you recall, the airports had all been shut down. And so none of the networks could get people here to Minnesota. And that started a nice job in which I could work part-time on interesting stories, but still say no if it wasn't convenient for me. And then as my kids got older, and initially they were like, Mom, can we sit on the field trip bus next to you? And after some time, they started saying things like, You're not coming on this field trip too, are you? So I started putzing around with a novel because deep down all journalists believe we have novels inside of us and eventually have to put up or shut up. And the result was Stalking Susan, and I was fortunate enough that the first agent I approached took it and ended up selling it shortly after that. And now I'm in the midst of a series that takes people inside the desperate world of television news here in Minnesota. And my trademark is that I really take people inside how newsrooms make decisions in times of crisis. And while you see things going very smoothly on the air, there's a lot of pushing and shoving going on behind the scenes. And I like to think all of my books address a different kind of nature of journalism. You can't have serial killers in every book because they're an unusual story. You don't have a whole lot of those in your career. So I've taken people inside how missing people, which ones get publicity and which ones don't. I've taken people inside the fine line between news and gossip and a whole lot of other different areas. What I like to tell people is when you read one of my books, you're gonna learn something new that you don't know before, whether it's wind farms or face blindness or whatever. But you're gonna read my book and you're not gonna say, I read a book like this, you know, just the other day.
I'm trying to decide if I should throw in the library question at this point, but we're gonna hold off on that for a little bit.
I preempted you.
Erin, several years ago, you won the Glimmer Train Short Story Contest, which is quite an honor.
Is it?
Yeah, for those of you who don't know it, it really is quite an honor, which encouraged you to turn your attention more fully, I know, to writing fiction. Why did you decide to turn your attention to writing mysteries?
It was hearing that irresistible story. I had heard the story of this red-haired girl that she'd been in the bog for 400 years, that she'd been beheaded, and I thought, I've got to figure out what might have happened to her. You know, what was going on in Ireland at the time? What was she doing in the bog? Why was it only her head? And then what would happen to her subsequently, and what was she connected to? You know, there are families in Ireland that go back centuries and millennia, and maybe she was connected to some family, and I started digging into the history of the time, which I didn't really know a lot about, also about archaeology, and especially wetlands archaeology, which is very, very different than dryland archaeology. And I had always been a mystery reader. People said to me, well, why don't you just write an ordinary novel about this? Well, to me, it was a mystery. It started out as a mystery, and it continued to be a mystery. Someone killed this girl, and I had to find out, even if it was 400 years later, I had to figure out who done it. And of course, my editor said, well, you have to have some contemporary chances being taken as well of people who are investigating this. There has to be some connection to their current life as well. And so in that first story, I set up kind of parallel mysteries. There's the 400-year-old case of the red-haired girl, but there's also a modern disappearance that my two characters get kind of caught up in. And they end up being connected. And so that's sort of my niche now. There's a historical mystery and a contemporary mystery. And because I believe the past and the present are intertwined, they always end up being connected in some way. So that's sort of an agreement that I have with readers, that this is something that I'm going to be able to do for them. I think people like those connections and those symmetries, and so that's what I try to do.
Chuck, you credit John Sanford, John Camp, with turning you to crime writing. Is that really all there is to it, or is it a more complicated issue than that?
I was desperate to escape the St. Paul newsroom. I mean, I sit alone in a room for a reason. I mean, I don't do real good in corporate structures, you know what I mean? You know, I didn't do real well in the Army. Fortunately, I was on a little team way off, stuck in the middle of nowhere. So that was a powerful incentive. I was fortunate, some of you know who Debbie Howell was, you know, tragically was killed in New Zealand a year ago. The book editor asked me to review a book. So I said, okay, so I wrote a book review. Afterwards, 3 or 4 reporters said, well, who wrote that for you? I figured this was a signal. And then Debbie took me aside, and I was this crazy street guy from Detroit, right? You know, and over a period of a year or so, she worked with me every weekend, writing, and sort of led me from insane convolution to mere complexity to. If you knew Debbie, she swore like a sailor. So I won't say exactly what she said, but she said, flip, flip, you broke a simple declarative sentence. And so that was a great boost being pointed in a direction. And so I figured that, well, you know, and John always says, what kind of, you want to write literary, you want to write commercial. And my books have sort of got lost, I was told, in the nether space between literary and commercial. You know what I mean? In fact, somebody accused me of writing cozies with attitude. You know, I should have taken him outside. I was just looking for a way, like, to tap dance out the door and make a living. I really enjoy research. Sometimes I get way too involved. So John was a big encouragement, and certainly Deborah Howell. You know. And it was such a long shot, I couldn't resist trying to do it.
Julie, in an Almanac interview you did with Kathy Wurzer, you said...
I feel like he's been stalking me.
Stalking Julie.
Yeah.
You said, essentially what you just said a moment ago, that all journalists believe that there's a book inside them. With 3 books to your credit now, that's certainly true in your case. But when you decided finally to tap the muse of fiction inside you, why did you turn to writing crime genre?
Well, I kind of write what I know, and I've covered a lot of crime stuff over the years. And I sat down, I don't write chronologically. The first chapter I wrote was actually what's chapter 3 in my first book. And I realized I'd written a character, but I hadn't written a book, and I needed to wrap a story around her. And I drew back on my years covering stories, and a story in St. Paul came to mind, and I had always called it the Susan story, and it was about 2 Susans who were murdered 25 years ago on the same day, 2 years apart. And I asked myself that question, what if, that authors have to ask, what if there were a serial killer targeting women named Susan? And I moved the murder, fictionally, I moved the murders across the river. I moved them from spring to fall. I changed the last name, and I almost changed the first names of the women, but I wanted to keep something of them in the book, so I kept the name Susan. And I turned it into a novel. And when it came out, I did a lot of radio and television interviews, and I always said the women's names, and I always reminded people that the cases were still open, and to please call the police department, because sometimes people see something and don't realize the significance until later, and other times people see something and are afraid to come forward until later. And people started calling the St. Paul Police Department, except they weren't calling them with tips. Instead, they were calling them saying things like, when are you jerks going to catch that Susan killer? And it wasn't the kind of calls that cities like to get, so they assigned the cases to the newly formed cold case unit there. And soon they had good news to report to the citizens of St. Paul, particularly them named Susan. And that was that there was not a serial killer targeting women named Susan in their city, that instead each woman had a separate killer, because they were able to use new forensics on the old evidence and use DNA, which was very new at the time of the murders, but now fairly routine. And they're in the process of running that DNA through the felon database. They have not come up with a hit yet, but now having DNA, they're closer to solving those cases than they've ever been. So I sort of feel like I got a little extra bang on that book. Besides having a good novel, I made a little news.
You have access to information we kill for.
I tend to live my research.
I'm going to ask you a research question in just a minute and give you a chance for show and tell, honestly. In advance of the panel, we communicated via email about the kinds of things that we might want to talk about. And Erin gave me one that I thought was really fascinating. In fact, Erin was the only one who gave me anything. Thank you very much, Erin.
Hey, I'm on deadline. My
I
next
know.
book's due at the end of this year.
We all use deadline as an excuse for everything. This was Erin's question. I'm sort of fascinated by the triggers for novels. How and what we see or hear around us turns into a whole novel. We could talk about what prompts us to say, there's the start of a story, as in a severed head found in a bog, or two Susans killed a year apart. Is it an image, a word, a place, or a singularly devious notion? God, I love this. A singularly devious notion that gets us going. So basically the question is this: where do our ideas come from? And how do you know when you've latched on to the right one? And since you asked the question, why don't you go ahead and give us our first answer?
Well, I'll return to the question my agent asked me. This is a series, right? And I said, yes. And I had no idea. I was going to write the story of the red-haired girl, and I hadn't a clue what my second book would be about, but I knew that there had to be one. So I often visit the National Museum in Ireland for inspiration. That's where they keep all of their bog people. And I began to notice some of the other displays around the bog people, and it seemed to me that there were a lot of weapons, beautiful weapons from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And there were beautiful gold pieces, necklaces, bracelets, sun discs, and different things. There's absolutely gorgeous, solid gold pieces from 2500 BC, from the year 100 AD. And I began to notice that a lot of these objects were found in bogs as well. And so I started digging up some more information about that. And it turned out that these were sacrifices to the gods in pagan times in Ireland. Weapons would be sacrificed to pray for victory in battle. The gold would be sacrificed because it's sort of a miraculous material. It never tarnishes, and it was associated with the sun in the ancient religions. And those things would be gathered up and cached in these little hoards and buried in the bogs. Some people think that possibly they were hidden to protect them from being stolen and things like that. But more and more there are people who believe that these are sacrifices. And as it turned out, the people that they have at the National Museum are probably also sacrifices, human sacrifices from the Iron Age. And so I began to see a thread develop between all of these objects. And it had to do with sacrifices and with bogs, because the bogs were holy places to the ancient people of Ireland. They weren't quite land, they weren't quite water, they were something in between. They were sort of liminal space between the worlds. And so I started to think, well, I should develop a story that begins there. And my husband used to work on a big industrial bog in the Midlands of Ireland. And these are huge tracts of land that are being developed for power generation. They cut the peat and ship it to power plants and little railways, and they burn it to generate electricity. And so it seemed to me that the place of sacrifice in ancient times was now itself being sacrificed. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of way to turn the story around. And there's always tension in a place like a bog as well, because it's an important environmental place. It's habitat for the animals. It's really important for filtration of water, the water table, all that kind of thing. But it's also the only good place to get a job in that part of the country. So we have the same sorts of things here with mining and with logging and other industries that are really terrible polluting industries, but they're the only thing you can do to make a living in those areas. So there's always this tension. And so I love that tension between the ancient and the modern, and the sacrifice, the place of sacrifice being sacrificed, and this environmental, social tension as well. And I thought, this is the place where this story needs to happen. And I went to visit an excavation where they were finding 2,000-year-old wooden roads buried underneath the surface of the bog. And of course I thought, well, maybe they find a person in there, because they have found people 2,000 years old in bogs. And then a friend emailed me and said, I was thinking, where can I get more details about a 2,000-year-old bog man? And a friend emailed me and said, guess what?
They just found a 2,000-year-old bog man in a bog in Offaly, where my husband is from. And I thought, what are the chances of that? And I was going over there 2 weeks later, and so I was reading the article aloud to my husband, thinking, well, I wonder if I could ever get out to that place, you know, and mentioned that a guy named Kevin Barry found the body, and it was 2,000 years old, they thought. And I'm reading it to my husband, thinking he'll say, well, that's great, you can use that in your book. And he says, did you say Kevin Barry was the guy who found the body? I said, yes. And he said, I think that fellow's my cousin. And so it was his cousin, and so we, 2 weeks later, went out to visit this place at the foot of an ancient holy mountain where he had found the torso of a 6'6" man buried in the bog in Ireland. And he was able to give me all of these details that I could use for Lake of Sorrows. So, I mean, it started with visiting the National Museum, and then it turned into all of these things that sort of grew out of those observations. So, I mean, I'm just fascinated by where the idea, the first initial spark takes you and leads you down a path that seems to sort of stick together. It's strange.
Go ahead, Chuck.
I have an anecdote about tension in a bog and in fact sparks. When I was doing research on a book, I was in Langdon, North Dakota, which is the dead center of the North American continent. That's why they put dozens, perhaps hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles there.
After the rain was set there.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is something you couldn't make up. So the cops take me out to the site of a launch headquarters. You know, there would be like 10 of these missiles connected to that place where the guys go down the elevator and sit under blah, blah, blah. You know, so it's a little kind of fortress. So one night, one of the guards is walking the perimeter and flips a cigarette. The next morning, over the fence. Next morning, they smell smoke. Lots of smoke. And then they discover they dug the command center 200 feet down in a peat bog. And all the wiring going out to 10 birds. And they started to behave erratically, and Russian satellites are monitoring this, and missiles are starting to go online and offline. And this went on for a year and a half. They couldn't put it out. Couldn't make that up. I think a lot of people drank a lot of Maalox. So I'm sorry for intruding.
Now, every so often, an idea comes to you, and you just have to say, thank you, Lord.
I know. Tammy, do you want to play?
Julie, I want you to talk about something a little different. Erin has touched on the research that she does for her stories. Chuck just talked about going out into the field and doing research. Gee, could you tell us a little bit about the research you do?
Most of the research I do, I tend to live on the job kind of thing, but occasionally you need to find out something different. And I wanted to have some experience shooting a handgun in order to write some scenes. The problem is I don't have a gun and I don't have bullets. But I have a friend who has a gun and bullets. Her name's Caroline Lowe, and she's the cop reporter at Channel 4. And I don't know if any of you know this, but she's also a licensed police officer and works 2 weeks a year at the state fair. And periodically has to get recertified to shoot. And so she took me along to the shooting range. It's kind of like a bowling alley. They have headphones, goggles, and at the far end they have an outline of a guy hanging there. And you point and you shoot, and the gun recoiled and it cut my hand, and I had gun residue all over myself. And I didn't even know if I hit the target until they pulled it up, close back again. And I know you're all dying to know what kind of a shot I am, aren't you? Here we go. The moral of that story is, don't mess with me. I'm a much better shot than Caroline, by the way. She really needs to practice.
Okay, we're going to save the library question until the very end. That's what we're going to end with. So think about your libraries. Chuck, you've already given us your library story. I love the mesh stockings. Let's open it up to folks here. If you have questions that you would like to ask anyone in the panel, feel free to go ahead and ask them, and we'll do our best to give you an answer. And Tim's going to come around with the microphone, so hopefully we'll make this easy.
Right.
Erin, you said a 2,000-year-old man was 6'6". Is that what you said?
He was only a torso,
Yeah.
so they measured his arm span and figured he was probably 6 feet 6 inches tall because your arm span is roughly equal to your height.
That's a giant.
From 2,000 years ago, yeah, he would have been really big.
You've told us about how you get your ideas for your books, but how do you construct your plots? How do you make sure that you don't, at the end, drop something into the plot which is totally contrary to something that happened at the beginning? Or do you, and then do you have to go back and be sure, read your book several times to make sure you haven't done that?
Well, and I think what you're asking is, do you outline or do you not outline? I basically am not a very good outliner, and I know my editor and my agent had wished that I would be a better outliner, but I think coming from a world of news, you don't outline the news. You kind of take things as it happens, so outlining does not feel particularly natural to me. So I just kind of have to make sure, and I have, a few people who I have read it at the end, keep a close eye for the kind of thing you're talking about to make sure that everything still makes sense.
Erin, Chuck, do you guys outline?
Hell no. Go ahead. For me, writing a novel is like doing the investigation along with the people. And if I know at the beginning who the killer is, and they don't, I'm going to telegraph that to the readers. So it's better if I don't know who it is, and find out sort of all the little details along with them.
Sometimes I change killers a couple of times in the course of writing.
You can be totally wrong.
Chuck.
Writing fiction, I try to write character-driven fiction. And how long does it take to get to know somebody really well? It takes a long time. It's harder when you're inventing them as you're getting to know them. And so a lot of times you don't know what they're saying or really doing on page 6 until you write page 366. You see what I mean? So there's this organic tension that develops in your imagination, And so an outline might be restrictive in that sense, because the characters surprise you.
Okay, that's one way of looking at it. I outline.
I'm envious.
I operate in this way. I think the story through in its entirety usually before I sit down to write it. So that story's in my head for weeks or usually even months. And once the ideas come to me like a severed head in a bog, I let that idea roll around in my head, and while it's up there, and I'm usually finishing the book I'm working on at the moment, events suggest themselves to me, chronology suggests itself, characters and motivations, all of those suggest themselves to me, so that at the end of that thinking period in my head, I know the story. I do what you guys do, it's just that I do it all up front, so that by the time I sit down to write, one of the things that I like about what I do is I never wake up in the middle of the night going, oh my God, what happens next?
I was wondering, there are so many talented mystery writers in this area. Is there something about Minnesota that lends itself to mystery writers?
We get asked this a lot outside Minnesota.
Yeah.
Well, I think that it's a self-perpetuating thing. I think we have so many because we have so many. And if you're living in a place where you're seeing other people have success writing books, you start to think, maybe I can do that. Whereas if you're living in a place where no one has ever had a book published, it seems an unattainable goal.
Any other takes on that?
I blame it on the long winters.
Minnesota is one of the big writer states, isn't this true?
Yeah. It's a big reader state.
There's a lot of publishing that goes on in Minnesota also. Other than that, I'm not, in my case, it was networking with people that I knew that were doing it.
And there's the great support for the arts here. There are great library systems here. I think that all sort of feeds
You know,
into.
That's my answer to that question is, we have great writers here, but we also have great visual artists, and we have great dance, and we have great theater. And the reason all of that exists here is that we live in a state that long ago made a decision to support the arts. We're at a place that fosters the arts, and I think we're a subset of just a lot of great art that's going on here.
And Minneapolis and St. Paul are well known as among the most literate cities in America. And you can't have writers without readers.
And the long winters turn all of our artistic tendencies toward murder.
Where did we get Jesse Ventura?
Yes.
You just said something a moment ago that sparked a different question than what I thought I would really ask. You mentioned the word imagination, and you've all described adult careers and professional life, but it just hit me. I wanted to ask, did you have active imaginations as children? And did you play out roles? And did you do those kinds of things where now that well-developed imagination came from something as a kid?
In this racket, we're relying on your imagination to make it work. You know, like if I do my job right, you'll provide 90% of the work because I want to induce you into. I want to, you know, get something to resonate in your experience, and you say, oh yeah, I know what that's like, so I can follow this a little farther. And so it's all about imagination.
Well, for imagination, I mean, when I wrote news, I often found myself wishing I didn't have to stick with the facts. I thought, darn the facts, if it wasn't for the facts, boy, could I tell a heck of a story. But rules are rules. So when I sat down to try and write fiction, I thought it would be very easy. But I found myself kind of craving facts, because making stuff up felt like cheating. And so I had issues to kind of work through in my mind before I could let my imagination take over. But I found news was a good background for fiction. We know how to work on deadlines, we type fast, we write lean and mean, and I have literally interviewed hundreds of people, many of them on the best or worst day of their lives. And I think that's helped me develop an ear for dialogue.
Erin, were you a daydreamer?
Total daydreamer, and still am. And I have to say, I still act out all the stuff in my books. I get my husband to come in, okay, now put your hands around my neck. Okay, now see if you can rest me to the ground.
How did you really hurt your shoulder? Wrestling in a bog.
We actually had a minor flood in our basement, and the laundry soap congealed into a block. And so my husband was going to the basement with a screwdriver. I said, what are you doing with that? He said, oh, the laundry soap, I'm going to break it up. And I said, oh, let me get the hammer. Couldn't find the hammer, so I got the hatchet instead. So I'm following him down the basement stairs with the hatchet, and he turned around and he said, if anybody could see us right now. So we still act out all the stuff in the books as much as we can.
As far as childhood goes, I grew up in a very rural part of the state along the Minnesota-Iowa state line, on a farm that's been in our family for more than 130 years. And my father was a popular rural storyteller in the area. And when people ask me about, you know, writing books and that, I actually think that I'm a better storyteller than I am actual writer.
We have time for one more question, and then we're going to do the library story, and then we have to call it an evening. This has gone very quickly.
This question is for Chuck. Have you considered writing mystery set in Vietnam with a Vietnamese protagonist?
I came that close a couple of years ago, doing a contemporary Vietnamese thriller, and I'm going to try to recycle it now.
Yeah. I buy that.
We had one very eager hand up here, so let's go ahead and go with that one. Last question.
I was going to ask you, you kind of began to touch on this. You sort of began to touch on this, but does visualizing a scene help you write it?
I always say I'm not really a writer because I don't write in chapters, I write in scenes. And maybe that's my theater background. I was a theater major in college and, you know, reviewed probably 1,000 plays in a few years of reviewing. I have to be there. I have to feel everything that's going on in that scene, the weather and the sunlight and all of that kind of, I have to really close my eyes and be there. That's why it's hard for me to sort of get into that place. And I keep reading about people who have these little rituals to sort of get them into their writing place, and I think, I need one of those. I don't have one. But I have to actually go and be in the place, and that's why I'm really annoyed that I broke my arm, because that's what I was planning to do, was to go and be on an organic farm in the west of Ireland, where my next story takes place, and I wasn't able to do that. I got a tour instead of the accident and emergency rooms.
I think if you're going to be a writer, you have to have the ability to sink yourself completely into the imagining of a place, so that you're going to be able to write about it texturally. You have to know what it's going to smell like and what it feels like, and as Chuck has been complimented on, what the mood is and all of that stuff. And I think the more you're able to sink yourself into it and visualize it, the better you're going to be able to put that into words on the page for the reader. Because this is a Friends of the Library event, when we talked with Karen Kepp, who, by the way, was just wonderful to work with in putting this together. Yeah, let's have it. I promised her that we would, each of us, tell a little bit about the importance of libraries to us in one way or another. I'll start.
Okay.
When I was 12 years old and was a Boy Scout in a small town in Ohio, I was that summer trying to earn my Reading Merit Badge. And part of the Reading Merit Badge requirement was that you had to volunteer at the local library, so I made arrangements to do that. And when I went to the library, this was back in the old days before they had computers, they put me to work date stamping the returned books. So, I had one of those date stamper things in an ink pad and going ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And after I'd been doing that for about an hour, the librarian came over to me, a very nice woman, and asked me the inevitable question, "So, Kent, do you like to read?" Well, the answer was yes, I liked to read, but what I really liked to read at that point were comic books. So I told her the truth. I was a Boy Scout. What are you going to do? And she didn't bat an eye. She said to me, "Have you ever read The Count of Monte Cristo?" So I walked out of the library that day with The Count of Monte Cristo under my arm. I came back about 3 days later and checked out The Man in the Iron Mask, and from there went to The Three Musketeers. And when I finished Dumas, everything Dumas had written, she asked me, "So, have you ever read H.G. Wells?" And she guided me through H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Arthur Conan Doyle she introduced me to. So for me, libraries are not just about housing the great literature that we know. It's also about hiring people who can guide you in terms of your development as a reader, particularly young. So librarians, I love you librarians, whoever you are. That's my story.
Bookmobiles were real important to me when I was growing up. And when the bookmobile came to town, and it was a little town that had like 38 people who lived there. And I was always hoping that the librarian there would bring me a new Phyllis A. Whitney book, because I love to read Phyllis A. Whitney. And then when I grew up and wrote a book, I happened to look online kind of for Phyllis A. Whitney and discovered, and this was like right before my book was going to come out that year, so that was like 3 years ago, I discovered she was still alive. And she was like 104 years old. But, still had this website, and it was very active in that, and I'm thinking, oh my God, Phyllis A. Whitney is still alive. I have to contact her and see if she'll give me a blurb for my book. But then I started to think, darn, if she's like 105, she might not want to, who knows how much time she has left. She might not want to spend it reading my book. So should I contact her? Should I not contact her? And I thought, I'm going to think about this overnight. And then the next day, online, I saw some AP thing saying, this was like 2 days later, saying that Phyllis A. Whitney had died. During that time, she had died, and I couldn't believe it. And the New York Times had obituaries, and everybody had obituaries, and all of this stuff. And I was going to speak at the Public Library Association meeting here in Minneapolis there, and talked about how libraries create authors. And talked about my Phyllis A. Whitney story and that, and wrote that. And I ended up putting it online on my website. And a few weeks later, her son contacted me. And he must have had a Google alert on her name or something, and he said, I saw the thing you wrote about my mom, and it's just wonderful. Could we put that on her website? Because we're updating it, you know, now that she's dead with some current stuff, and, you know, and I said, absolutely.
You gave her a blurb. Very nice. Erin.
Well, the ritual in our family was to go to the library just before we were going to the lake, and everybody brought like 2 grocery bags full of books from the library up to the lake. And I remember reading the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit up there. I remember reading Watership Down. That was a really big thing in the 70s. I remember reading War and Peace at the lake. And it was my turn to do the dishes that night, and my mother said, it's your turn to do the dishes. I said, Mom, I just lived through the Battle of Austerlitz. I don't think I can do the dishes. She said, it's your turn to do the dishes. No sympathy whatsoever. I don't know what she was reading at that time, but that was what we did. We went to the library, we checked out books, and we got the fattest novels we could find and brought them to the lake, and that's what we did, just lay on the beach and play cards and read books.
Chuck, anything to add to the mesh stocking story?
It seems to me that in the early 60s, Detroit had a huge public library back a long time. And I actually dated a woman, Merle, Peggy. But she actually, when she worked late, we both go on the roller skates through the stacks in the basement. and feed to pneumatic tubes as they came out. That was a memorable experience.
That belongs in a book. It totally does.
We have hit the time. Boy, we had a great time up here. I hope you folks did too. Thank you so much for coming this week.